Hello, I'm Pastor Brett Jenkins, and I'm doing this book review for Lutheran Core. A few years ago in my congregation, before I arrived, there was a little incident that has become the stuff of local legend. One of the Sunday school teachers began showing up, a man began showing up dressed as a woman, presenting himself as a woman to the children. When parents expressed reservations about the situation, the pastor assured them that he was dealing with the situation. And from his perspective, he was. He was providing pastoral counseling to the man who was dealing with what is now called gender dysphoria. And he was trying to help him as a pastor helps a parishioner, helping him seek psychological help, helping him explore the feelings, helping him come to understand what this meant in light of his identity in Christ. However, he did not pull him out of his role as a Sunday school teacher in order to do this. And this didn't satisfy the parents, who went to the church council and insisted they take immediate action. Council did, removing this person from their post as a Sunday school teacher and causing some alienation between the pastor and the council, that they had felt the need to step out and take authority into their own hands. This is less than a decade ago. But I don't think that the situation could have been dealt with in the same way at this moment in our American history. That is what prompted Ryan T. Anderson to write the book When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Published in 2018, I ordered this book because I heard that Amazon had banned its sale. And I'm enough of an old school liberal that if somebody is going to ban a book, I want a copy and want to find out what is so dangerous about it. I find the book to be remarkably compassionately written and balanced, but clearly in opposition to the idea that a man can become a woman, or that biological bodies make no difference, and that our perceived sense of gender is what is truly authentic. It at least contests that position while behaving and speaking responsibly and compassionately about those who are dealing with the issues related to gender dysphoria. This book is really about the rise of the modern self. And in that way, it builds on the work of people like philosopher Charles Taylor or psychologist Philip Rieff. Many people have done work in this area. And I remember a couple of years ago, it might be an apocryphal story, but I remember that one major Lutheran commentator, Martin Marty, saying the church was going to be forced in the next 200 years to more carefully articulate its religious anthropology, and that he thought it would take 200 years to accomplish that work. This notion of the modern self, of expressive individualism, is what prompted, I think, the transgender moment, as Ryan Anderson calls it. And it outlines the work yet to be done for us as the church. I want to just read a few sections of the book to you that will give you a sense of it. The book is really a detailed account of not only where the ideas came from, but mostly how they marched through our institutions and how it's playing. Dr. Anderson, I believe, is part of a political think tank, so his take on it is more political. This is useful information for us to have as it's impacting our local communities. It maybe doesn't draw as much inferral for our direction forward as church as it might, which is why I've paired it with this book review with another book review. But I want to read for you a little from the introduction of Dr. Anderson's preface to the paperback edition. He begins by reflecting upon Andrea Long Chu's New York Times op-ed piece entitled, "My New Vagina Won't Make Me Happy." Andrea Long Chu is a transgender woman, and if you're not familiar with how the nomenclature works, that means a biological man who believes or feels that they are truly a woman. He writes, Chu was scheduled to undergo vaginoplasty surgery several days after the article appeared. Next Thursday, I will get a vagina, wrote Chu. The procedure will last around 6 hours, and I will be in recovery for at least 3 months. Would this bring happiness? Probably not, Chu admitted. But that was beside the point. This is what I want. But there is no guarantee it will make me happier. In fact, I don't expect it to. That shouldn't disqualify me from getting it. Chu argues that the simple desire for sex reassignment surgery should be all that is required for a patient to receive it. No further consideration for authentic health and well-being should enter in. No concern about poor outcomes should prevent a doctor from performing the surgery if a patient wants it. And no amount of pain, anticipated or continuing, justifies its withholding. That's a quote from the article. According to Chu, surgery's only prerequisite should be a simple demonstration of want. The flattening of our understanding of what a human person is into simple desire and will is in large part what this book is about, as is the book I've paired this review with. What is important for us to think about is that as cultural and policy changes in this regard have come to the fore, as the education, not just in the primary and secondary schools, although that's probably what's most alarming to people in the immediate sense, but mostly in the college campuses, has been dominated by this ideology, arguably for at least 60 years, certainly for at least 20. Which means that those who are educating our young people were educated in this themselves. The question I think these books will raise for us as we wrestle with them is, how can churches that hold to the traditional biblical vision that in God's providential plan there are two distinct identifiable biological sexes, and that a properly ordered sense of our gender identity is strictly in congruity with our bodies, how can we expect to be treated? It's a question for us not only legally, although we should take the precautions necessary in that regard, but also catechetically and apologetically. How should this impact our ministries? Dr. Anderson's book is not especially helpful in this regard, which is why I've paired it with the other book I'm going to pair it with. But a couple of salient quotes from Dr. Anderson's book that will give us a sense of before we move on to the next. A quote from a Margaret McCarthy that's in this book. She writes, "To have a sexual body is to find ourselves already in relations we do not simply choose, and even more in relations that define us, constitutive relations. To have a sexual body places us before three such relations. Being sexual, we are born, and as such are children, sons and daughters, owing our existence to others. Being effectively an inheritance. Then, being sexual, we are already poised toward the opposite sex. To say male or female is already to have the other in view. Finally, being sexual, we are potentially mothers or fathers. All of this then situates our freedom, and dramatically so, whether we like it or not." The biblical sense of identity, as rich and pre-modern as it is, presumes the kind of things that Ms. McCarthy needs to make articulate and explicit here. The Genesis narrative that is for us constitutive, the idea that we are made in the image of God as foundational to our religious anthropology, is in many ways anathema to the sense of identity that can inform a transgender moment. These are the kind of things the church is going to need to reckon with and wrestle with. Later in the book, he recounts the fight between parents and a school in Minnesota, the Nova Classical Academy. In this fight, a woman named Emily Zeno came to the fore as she was doing this. And it's interesting to me especially that this was a classical academy, meaning it was to be rooted in a great books tradition of the West. That they should so quickly and thoroughly buy into this new way of understanding the human person as first and foremost an individual, an expression of desire and will, and only secondarily in relations, rather than the other way around. Ms. Zeno writes this. She goes, first, schools will teach children to accept an ideology that is predicated on the lie that biological sex always plays second fiddle to a self-proclaimed subjective gender identity, and that the sex of one's body is mutable or even irrelevant. This isn't just an idea you can tuck away in a unit study or an anti-bullying presentation. It will inevitably find its way into every aspect of a school and make a deep impression on the developing minds of children. For example, girls, under the regressive mandates of anti-bullying and gender inclusion policies, would have to agree to call boys in their locker room girls, effectively losing their rights to free speech and to privacy from males. And science, particularly biology, would die a quick death at the hands of a concept that necessarily eradicates observable facts about human sexuality. Gender ideology in the curriculum is a lie enshrined as truth. That lie enshrined as truth is already very likely impacting the lives of our congregation members. I was flummoxed recently at a confirmation class to hear the 7th grade daughter of a woman who teaches in a local Christian school but whose daughter is in the public school come in and articulate just this position and explain how horribly sexist and non-inclusive her local school was, because it had not yet formally adopted all these things. But she had picked up the ideology from the classes that it's teaching. The bathrooms have not yet been conformed to the ideology, but the ideology is already being taught in the local school. Again, in a rather conservative, relatively rural area of Pennsylvania. Ms. Zeno goes on to ask these questions. Will we allow our young and vulnerable children to be fed a false anthropology rather than teaching them to speak the truth boldly? Will we consent to our children's sterilization rather than patiently guiding them toward appreciation of their bodies? Will we treat our children's mental health issues with double mastectomies rather than demand that doctors provide a true remedy? These are the kind of questions that we're struggling with as a culture. A final quote from this book before moving on. And it's about those you may have heard of, people who detransition. There is much public pressure to subvert or suppress the testimony of people who detransition. Meaning, they get completely or partly into a sex change process, realize they've made a mistake, and seek to return to their biological gender. Their biological sex, I should say. Dr. Ryan writes this, many people who have detransitioned say they felt pressured to transition and are now being attacked from the political left for detransitioning. But many also say that people on the political right make them feel like misfits in society, and that's part of what led to their desire to transition in the first place. Dr. Ryan writes, we must avoid adding to the pain experienced by people with gender dysphoria while we present them with alternatives to transitioning. This highlights for us the pastoral care needs of the people around us, not only those who will be dealing with gender dysphoria themselves, and there's a widely increased number of people dealing with that. To see another banned book, look at Abigail Schreier's book on the subject, which looks at how this is particularly impacting young women. This is, in my estimation, a modern-day reviving Ophelia that ought to be getting lauded and attended to, but instead is being vilified because of the political energy around this transgender issue. And we're not only going to need to provide pastoral care for people dealing with gender dysphoria, but with people who have been badly catechized into this false vision of what human anthropology is, and so are being supportive of people, or they think they're being supportive of people with gender dysphoria in a way that may be making their situation worse, and certainly makes no sense in light of their identity in Christ. We're going to need to do both as a church. And that is where this new book by Carl Trueman, Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution, comes into play. So you can see it a little better. This is a condensation for busy people of his earlier book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Dr. Trueman, who is a professor at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, had the foreword to this book written by Dr. Anderson. So there's obviously continuity between the work. This may be the more helpful book for us. This gives us the background on how we got to where we are. This may be the more helpful book for those of us who are trained in theology to begin unpacking and reconstructing a truly biblical anthropology of the human person. But as you can see from the little tabs where I'm going to pull quotes from, maybe even a little more helpful for us in having an idea about the direction we should be dealing with this in our ministries locally and as quickly as possible, given the fact that the transgender moment is already upon us. This book is suitable for a book study in a church. This is not a particularly heavy lifting book, but it's not particularly light either. He can only, take it down so many notches to make it understandable for everyone. But it was designed actually for Washingtonian staffers, so for non-specialists. This could make it a useful book for education in the local parish. So I'm going to read to you what I think is a section which I think really captures the central thesis of this book about halfway through the book. Dr. Trueman writes, I would argue that the coincidence of two things makes our current moment in time a singularly challenged and potentially sinister one. These two things are the plastic conception of human identity, to which expressive individualism tilts, and the liquefaction of the world around us with regard to the traditional frameworks, national, religious, familial, geographical, and even physiological, by which human beings have previously defined themselves. That places us in a situation without obvious historical parallel. So, this rise of the modern self that he's detailing for us, this rise towards expressive individualism, and again, this book's very helpful in that regard, has placed upon us a moment where we need to act. But we need to act wisely. So I want to share with you what I think are some helpful pieces that come out of this book. I again strongly recommend the purchase of both these books, but maybe this one even more in terms of immediate application. And if you need to budget your purchase of books. A couple ideas for us to reflect upon, a couple of quotes from this book that may be helpful. Dr. Trueman writes, if we are to find a precedent for our times, I believe that we must go further back in time than recent history. There, Christianity was a little understood, to the 2nd century and the immediately post-apostolic church. There, Christianity was a little understood, despised, marginal sect. It was suspected of being immoral and seditious. Eating the body and blood of their God and calling each other brother and sister, even when married, made Christians and Christianity sound highly dubious to outsiders. And the claim that Jesus is Lord was on the surface a pledge of loyalty that derogated from that ode to Caesar lamentation for Christianity's cultural marginalization. That is much like the situation of the church today. For example, we are considered irrational bigots for our stance on gay marriage. In the aftermath of the Trump presidency, it has become routine to hear religious conservatives in general, and evangelical Christians in particular, decried as representing a threat to civil society. Like our spiritual ancestors in the 2nd century, we too are deemed immoral and seditious. And I think he's right. We should expect to be treated that way more and more. We should expect that if we have active youth in our church, they will decline from inviting friends to attend because they're probably being a little coy about the fact that they even attend a church. They may be socially embarrassed about the fact that their parents make them go to church. Another pastor in the North American Lutheran Church in which I serve recently shared with me that several of their younger families recently transferred out because they couldn't understand why we couldn't just get with the program in terms of sexual identity, why we thought this was central to the biblical witness, or at least central to biblical faithfulness. The witness is about Christ, but faithfulness entails a correct understanding of who the human person is. For Christ became an incarnate human person. He goes on to maybe outline some helpful ideas for the church as we begin to consider our engagement. And it's important we consider that engagement because this moment is not simply going to pass us by. We can't put our heads in the sand and think this is all crazy talk and it will pass, because too many people have been educated in it already for it to pass without active work on our part and the work of many. He writes this, and I think this is helpful. He says, many Christians talk of engaging the culture. In fact, the culture is most dramatically engaged by the church, presenting it with another culture, another form of community, rooted in her liturgical worship practices and manifested in the loving community that exists both in and beyond the worship service. Many talk of the culture war between Christians and secularism, and certainly the Bible itself uses martial language to describe the spiritual conflict of this present age. But perhaps cultural protest is a way of better translating that idea into the modern idiom, given the reality and history of physical warfare in our world. The church protests the wider culture by offering a true vision of what it means to be a human being made in the image of God. Wise words, I think, as we consider our responses, catechetical and apologetic. And here I would say our catechesis is going to be not just focused on our young people, but increasingly we're going to need to be engaged in very serious adult catechesis as people coming in to our church's orbit have no idea that they have abandoned a biblical worldview on the nature of humanity because they've imbibed these narratives that are everywhere present in our culture. A final exhortation from Dr. Trueman here, a couple of quotes here. He exhorts us to get back to natural theology and use the theology of the body by the late John Paul II. He writes, "What is natural law? Put simply, it is the idea that the world in which we live is not simply morally indifferent stuff, but possesses in itself a moral structure. Our bodies, in particular, have a profound significance. We connect to others through our bodies. We are dependent on others because of our bodies. Our bodies are not containers that we happen to inhabit and animate. They are in a deep and significant way integral to our identity, to ourselves." Christian history is replete with the necessity of repelling Gnosticism again and again. First, the division of soul from body, and then the elevation of soul over body. The Gnosticism of transgenderism is just that. It is Gnosticism. It is positing that our will, our soul, can in some fundamental way be separated from our bodies. This cannot be, and Orthodox Christian ideas about the human person also be true. We are embodied individuals. In fact, we are embodied persons. Our identities go far beyond our individual will and overlap in networks of community that are generative and constitutive to our being. There is no point at which we become properly emancipated from them. To do so is to posit a self that is completely ahistorical. And we should remember Augustine's famous definition of sin, as in curvatus in se, to be curved in upon oneself. I conclude these book reviews by recommending both of these books highly to you. But perhaps lifting this one up as the more useful one as we begin to consider our pastoral responses, our pastoral care, our preaching, and our teaching ministries within the local church. This is not something a pastor will be able to do alone. We need our other people who have the gifts of teaching and shepherding alongside us in this. We need to be creating communities of virtue, as Alistair McIntyre noted in his book After Virtue, that help preserve, pass on, and better articulate a true sense of human identity. I hope this book review was helpful to you, and may you be blessed in all your ministries. May our risen Christ continue to strengthen and guide you.